have Steph and I. And again, there's a Google link. Steph, I'm sorry, I'm on slide 3. There's a Google link there, so if you have not logged into that, please do that. And that's in the chat box of the menu bar that's off to your right. Next slide. So I just wanted to run through that today we're really addressing just tiers 1 and 2. And we're not doing item by item, but we're just doing some of the necessary evidence and resources that you'll need and the possible location and where those would be housed. So some of the data sources that we look at are, just having that walkthrough that you do when you're doing the TFI. But we also want you to consider, so if you were to leave or a new coach, administrator, a team member were to walk into your building, would they be able to pick up from where that other coach, administrator, team member left? So is it easily accessible? Do you have written documentation? And if so, do you have directions on how to access it? So, sometimes it's in a Google Drive, and to give the specifics of where it's located in that Google Drive so people can find it. We have had concerns with that. Next slide. So on here, we're looking at items 1.1, 1.2, 2.1, and 2.2. And this is really that team composition and the operating procedures. So this is included in a lot of the items that you need to have available for evidence. And as you can see, what they're looking for is that you're documenting the date, the time, location, facilitator, as well as the team members who are part of your team and the agenda. So they're looking at all of this information that's included on this sheet. We also have another example here on slide 6 that you can see. So this is just a Google Sheet. So some schools, what they do is they take that the information from the other slide, the meeting minute form, and they put it into this document. And you can see on the bottom they have the tabs, so they can put all of their information from each of their meetings in one document and tab through each of their monthly meetings. And slide 7. So here's an example of a staff handbook that a school may have, and this may be an actual hard copy or it may be an electronic copy. Again, what you want to remember is making sure that this is accessible to others, so if someone were to walk into your building to take over a position, that they're able to get at this and find this information very easily. And you can see there's quite a bit of information in the topic part, so it's referencing all the different areas that you may have documentation for. And this staff handbook, again, is referenced many times throughout the TFI as looking for evidence that you may need for your assessment. Slide 8. So here's a tier 1, some other evidence that you may want to put in there. So this is just examples of what you would be putting in. So your expectations and your cool tools. Next slide. As well as you may want to be putting in your definitions that you have. Those school-wide expectations are your cool tools that you would be teaching to your students. These are all examples of evidence that could be put in the staff handbook or your PBIS handbook. Slide 9. So a lot of this information is discussed through that walkthrough or maybe observed in the walkthrough. So you may be checking in a room to see, do they have a classroom matrix? Do they have, like Mrs. Meyer's classroom menu? So they talk about some of the acknowledgments that they have and how many points they need to get them. So just examples of things or artifacts that you have for your TFI or for your PBIS implementation. So slide 10. So about 4 times a year you need to provide feedback to your staff. That's what the requirement is in the TFI. But many schools provide data and receive feedback monthly. The SAS, which is the bright color that you see on the top, there's one way that staff provide feedback. So that's one thing that you might be able to incorporate as an artifact into your assessment, as well as include it as one of the times that you're receiving feedback from your staff. Next slide. And then this one is looking at the student committee that you might have to provide input for maybe acknowledgments or maybe some expectations in the classroom, as well as also if you have a family and community subcommittee. So this committee is probably not going to be meeting at school, but we definitely want to include them. So if you look at the upper right, they're going to be included as part of the team members for that core team that you have, and you might have a rotating family member or community member that comes in, but you definitely want to get some input from them. And definitely when you have a family and community subcommittee, you want to give them a task, and you don't just want to give them, like have them meet and maybe help with your consequence system or acknowledgments. But if you're looking at the current data, that line that's in there, 30% of our student body is tardy, 70 of those tardies are for first period. So that could be that parents aren't getting the kids to school. So maybe there's a way as the community members and families that they can determine a way, how can we get more students to school to overcome this issue that we have with our school. Again, this is really looking at what are the artifacts that you should have within your book to reference when you're doing the TFI assessment. And now I'm going to turn this over to Stephanie, and she's going to talk about some Tier 2 items.
So for items 1 and 2 of Tier 2, they're similar to Tier 1, so Jen already discussed those in terms of teaming and composition of your team. And for the TFI item 2.3, the screening refers to utilizing Tier 1 behavior and academic data to identify students that need additional support. So here are some examples of possible evidence of Tier 2 flowchart. And this is actually from Maplewood Middle School in Menasha. Thanks, Chip. Chip's on the call, and they gave him permission to use some of their resources. The Excel spreadsheet in the corner is an example of organizing data by classroom teacher. So each student is listed on the left-hand side, and on the columns are the types of data sources. And then each teacher would have a tab. Just an example. Request for assistance, item 2.4. Here's an example of a document that you could use for a request for assistance form. It's really simple. It's actually within our Tier 2 training workbook. The school determines like how a request for referral takes place. But it is recommended that whether it's through a conversation or an email, that it's documented, consistently documented in the same fashion for a referral from staff, students, and families, and that the team responds within 3 days. Evidence for items 2.5 and 2.7 can include your school's targeted intervention reference guide. I can show you this in a minute when we look at the TFI manual. It's on page 30 of the manual. And on page 29 of the manual is actually a description of how to utilize this guide in an example which is shown on the slide. The guide provides you with a place to list your interventions that you offer within your school and what needs or need can be met given that intervention. So for example, for this student school that has check-in, check-out, they have noted that check-in, check-out suffices for the needs of all the items listed under the left-hand column. And so if they had a student that was needed access to peer attention, they would either pick check-in, check-out, social skills club, reading buddies, or lunch buddies. So that's the matching to the student need. Another artifact that can be utilized in this situation is a Tier 2 flowchart, which does have the intervention options right on it. Providing professional development to all relevant staff, and relevant is the word in the descriptor on the TFI, is critical. Item 2.9 requires written documentation used to teach and coach all staff. So these are some ways of showing evidence that you are teaching all staff. Again, the handbook, the staff handbook, I highlighted on the bottom the Tier 2 focused areas on the index of that staff handbook. And then you might have a calendar of professional development that highlights what specifically around PBIS has been reviewed with staff. And remember that discussion and reviewing data is also allows for that reflection and adaptive shift from staff. The automated tracking tool is on the Wisconsin PBIS Network website. It allows schools to document their Tier 2 supports and the criteria for success of each intervention. So the number of students in each support and the number of students making progress towards the goal can be documented right in this tool, and it automatically generates the response rate or the number of percentage of students that are successfully meeting the being successful on the intervention. So this can actually be used for items 210 and 211. It's one example. You don't have to use it. A school board annual evaluation report is definitely evidence of assessing overall effectiveness of your system. The evaluation report includes measures of implementation and student outcome data. And it also looks at fidelity and student outcome data over time to see changes in those data. Also included are practices of Tier 1 and, if implementing, advanced tiers, and alterations in processes based on the evaluation. So Jen and I just covered some possible data sources to look at when completing the TFI. We didn't get into every item on the TFI. This is not meant to be covering all aspects of all items on this assessment. But we did have a request to look at different possible evidence sources and thought it would be helpful for everybody. Which leads us back to the fidelity measure, which is our items on the actual TFI. You're completing the TFI. And you have to look at your fidelity as well and create an action plan. So we reviewed some of this in webinar 1, but we wanted to come back and circle around to the TFI and action planning, and when would you do this? So here is just an example of when you might complete the TFI. So the TFI is completed annually, at least annually, for tiers that are in place. So you might be at fidelity on Tier 1, and you've moved on, you're trained in Tier 2, and you self-assess in Tier 2, but you're not at fidelity, you're still scaling up. And you decide as a school to do quarterly assessment given the TFI. Because you're also using the TFI not just as your annual tool, but your progress monitoring tool. So in this example, you complete your annual assessment, a walkthrough, and your annual assessment in May and June, and develop your annual action plan. You progress monitor in October or November. You pick a couple items from Tier 2 to action plan around. You also have your staff complete the SAS, and you re-look at your action plan and make updates and changes on it. In January and February, you progress monitor again the same items that you've been working on, and make changes in your action plan. And again in March and April. Now you could assess or progress monitor up to 4 times a year. You might choose to do 3 times a year, so it might look more like annually assess in May and June, progress monitor in November, and progress monitor in March. And then you're going to create that action plan, because the purpose of any assessment is to use that data. And we're going to look at certain items that we want to improve on, that we decide as a team. For in this example, item number 5 is what the team chose to action plan around. And they noted from October 10th to December 10th, they noted improvement in their implementation in that specific area of problem behavior definition. So choose 1 or more tiers to focus on, choose 2 to 3 items within the tier, and then progress monitor 2 to 3 times in addition to the annual assessment. Okay. So I just wanted to point out some resources for you. If you go on to the PBIS, Wisconsin PBIS Network, and all I am doing is typing in TFI in the search engine. I'm going to click on the first link that comes up, and here is a page that is a brief overview of the TFI. And on the bottom are some resources. So you have the TFI manual and the training deck, information on the walkthrough, and then some of the videos, and we'll be putting more on there as well, including this one. So within the TFI manual, there is a action plan. I'm just going to skip down, further down, right here. And it's just the way it is, you would write it in. Within the PBIS apps website, which I'm going to go to right here, if you go to applications and PBIS assessment, and you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you can see the list of the fidelity measures, and I'm going to go into the TFI. Okay. So on this page, on the bottom here, there's also the TFI walkthrough video, the training slide deck, and an action plan, which comes up in the form of a Word document. And this allows you to move things around and create your own action plan, and allows an electronic copy. So you can then create your action plan within this document, which people find helpful. Okay, I'm going to go back to the training slide deck for a second. The training slide deck is very helpful in administering the TFI. And I want to show you an example of that. It goes through some general information which we've covered in our webinars. It also, when you get down to the items, it really specifies more information around the item. For example, this is just item 1.1, but it talks about who's there and gets into more detail. And really the detail on this training slide is helpful, especially in terms of the questioning that they have right here. The scoring is the same on the manual, but the questioning and the tips, like the main ideas, can be very helpful on some of the items. So I recommend that you dig into the training deck to look at items more specifically and to help to action plan around those items as well. So those are the resources that I pointed out in the slides. Here, and pbisapps.org. So I am going to leave everyone muted, but if you could please either type in the chat box or raise your hand for any questions or any takeaways throughout this series of webinars on the TFI. We would greatly appreciate it. So I'll be looking for either hands raised or chats in the chat box. If you raise your hand, I will unmute you. So Colleen wanted to know if any schools are currently using request for assistance. And I'm going to open that up to the schools on the line. If you are using a request for assistance, can you let me know either by raising your hand or putting your information in the chat box?
anyone is unsure of how to raise their hand, it's in the upper right corner. There's a menu bar, and it's the bottom one. There's a little green arrow. If you click on that with the hand, then Stephanie will be able to see that you've raised your hand.
Other questions and takeaways? We are repeating this webinar series starting in January. So any takeaways that would be helpful to us as we repeat this would be appreciated. So Brian said that they found the slide deck really helpful for completing the TFI and plan on using it for action planning. Thank you. If anyone has any hesitation in completing the TFI, we would appreciate knowing what that is. And if we can assist with any further questions or discussion around what that hesitation might be. Susan likes the additional materials that we shared so they can update the information for new staff. And I'll just say again that those are examples of potential. You might have different things that look differently, and it's really that written documentation that is important. Other questions, ahas? Jen, do you have anything to add?
I don't know.
Yeah, and Colleen said that reviewing the handbook as a professional development opportunity is something we could benefit from. And again, remembering to cycle back around on information is helpful for that repetition of knowledge and letting it take hold in our brains is important. All right, well, people are leaving the show, so I am ready to say goodbye to everybody. If you have any questions, Jen and I can stay on the line. Thank you all for joining our series. Thank you, Susan. Thanks for being here. Yeah, you stay warm. Susan said to stay warm. Lori, nice job. Oh, thank you, Lori. Lori is a colleague, and she's saying nice job. Thank you, Chip, for letting us use your resources.